I turned 63 the same year I finally paid off the house, and I remember thinking that was the best gift life could have given me. No mortgage, no debt, just 4,200 square feet of oak floors and a wraparound porch that my wife, Carol, had picked out the wallpaper for in every single room. We'd built something real, something that was supposed to outlast us. That's the part that still gets me, even now. We built it to last. My daughter had been married for 6 years by the time any of this happened. She was 31, smart as anyone I've ever known, and she had a laugh that sounded exactly like her mother's. When she brought her husband home the first time, I shook his hand and told myself I liked him. He was tall, well-dressed, worked in finance, said all the right things, called me sir for the first 2 years and then switched to my first name like we'd been friends since college. I told myself that was a good sign. People don't relax around you unless they trust you, right? I told myself a lot of things back then. Carol and I had been married for 38 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a pad of paper by the phone, who noticed when something was off before anyone else in the room had even registered a change in temperature. I used to tease her about it, called her a human lie detector. She'd just smile and say she paid attention. That's all. She just paid attention. I want you to remember that, because it matters. It was the weekend of Thanksgiving. Our daughter and her husband drove up Thursday morning, and by noon the house smelled like butter and rosemary, and the particular kind of warmth that only happens when everyone you love is under one roof. My grandson, he was 4, still at the age where everything is magic, was chasing the dog through the hallway, while Carol told him to slow down and laughed while she said it. My son-in-law was in the living room watching the game. He had a beer in his hand and his feet up on my coffee table, and I almost said something, but I let it go. It was Thanksgiving. You let things go. Dinner was good. Everything was fine. That's the thing about a day like that. It's impossible to explain how fine everything seemed. We talked about my grandson starting pre-K, about a trip my daughter wanted to take in the spring, about whether the team on TV had a shot at the playoffs. My son-in-law made a joke that made Carol laugh, and I watched him accept the laugh like it was something he'd earned. After dinner, the men stayed at the table while Carol and my daughter cleared. My son-in-law poured himself a second glass of bourbon and asked me how I was thinking about the property. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd been doing some reading, that land values in our county had doubled in the last 8 years, that there were developers circling the area, that a few of the old farms on Route 9 had already sold for well over asking. He said that if I was thinking about retirement income, there might be a smart way to structure things. Move some assets, protect against estate taxes, that kind of thing. I told him Carol and I had a plan, that we'd worked with an attorney years ago, that everything was in order. He nodded. He said, of course, of course. He said he was just thinking out loud. I didn't think about it again until 2 days later. Friday, Carol and my daughter went shopping. My son-in-law offered to take my grandson to the park down the road, and I said I'd stay home. I had some things to go through in my office, mostly just mail I'd been ignoring, a few end-of-year documents from the accountant. Nothing urgent. I sat down at my desk around 10 in the morning with a cup of coffee and started sorting through the stack. About halfway through, I found something I didn't recognize. It was a single page, folded in thirds, tucked between 2 pieces of junk mail. At first, I thought it was a brochure, but when I unfolded it, I saw it was a printed email. The header showed it had been sent from my son-in-law's work address to a law firm in the city, not our family attorney, someone I'd never heard of. The subject line said, Property transfer, preliminary review. I read it once and didn't understand it. I read it again, and my stomach dropped. The email outlined a plan. Not a suggestion, not a question, a plan. It referenced our home address and the adjacent lot we owned on the east side of the property, the one Carol's father had left us. It referenced a specific clause in a state law about transfers to dependent family members and said, and I am not paraphrasing here, that if the primary holder could be established as having diminished capacity, a conservatorship filing would allow an appointed family member to act on his behalf in property matters. The primary holder, that was me. I sat there for a long time. Diminished capacity. I turned 63 in April. I coached my grandson's soccer team in September. I drove Carol to her appointments, handled our finances, had a full conversation about contract law with my accountant 6 weeks ago, and someone who had eaten dinner at my table the night before, someone who had laughed at Carol's jokes and called me by my first name, had written to a lawyer about whether I could be declared mentally unfit so he could take control of my property. I didn't know what to do. That's the honest answer. I sat at my desk and I didn't know what to do. The thing people don't tell you about a moment like that is that your first instinct isn't anger. It isn't even fear. It's disbelief. You keep reading the same sentences over and over, waiting for them to mean something different. You think, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Maybe this is something else. Maybe there's a version of this that makes sense. I folded the paper back up and put it in my desk drawer. I locked the drawer. I sat there with my cold coffee and waited for Carol to come home. She walked in at 2 o'clock, carrying 3 bags and a smile, and the moment she saw my face, the smile disappeared. She put the bags down. My daughter was right behind her, but Carol looked at me first and said quietly, "What happened?" I told her I needed to talk to her alone. My daughter took my grandson upstairs. My son-in-law wasn't back yet. Carol sat down at the kitchen table and I put the paper in front of her. I didn't say anything. I just watched her face. She read it twice, the way I had. Then she looked up at me, and there was something in her eyes that I recognized immediately, not surprise. Not quite. It was the look of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be confirmed. I asked her if she'd seen something before, if she'd known anything. She said no. Not known, but she said she'd noticed, over the past year, small things. The way my son-in-law asked about the property taxes and seemed to be calculating rather than just making conversation. The way he'd suggested, twice, that I might want to see a doctor about my memory after I forgot a dinner reservation in July. The way he'd asked my daughter once, in front of Carol, whether I'd ever been evaluated for anything. She'd told herself she was being unfair, that she was reading into things. She picked up the phone and called our attorney that afternoon. Here's what I need to tell you, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why didn't you confront him? Why didn't you say something right then? And I understand that. I wanted to. I wanted to walk out of that kitchen the moment my son-in-law came back through the door and put that paper on the table and watch his face fall apart. I wanted to. But Carol put her hand on mine and said, not yet. She said we needed to know how far this had gone. She said if we confronted him now, with nothing but one printed email, he'd deny it, he'd destroy everything else, and we'd never know the full picture. She said we had one chance to do this right. She was right. She was always right about these things. And I hated it, but I listened. We spent the rest of that weekend pretending. That was the hardest part, sitting across the table from my son-in-law at breakfast, watching him refill my coffee, hearing him talk about Christmas plans, and keeping my face neutral. Carol was better at it than I was. She's always been better at that kind of thing. She asked him about work, laughed at the right moments, passed the butter like nothing in the world had changed. Sunday afternoon, they packed up the car. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door, the way he always did, and looked me in the eye, and said it had been a great Thanksgiving. I said it had. I watched him walk to the car, and I stood on the porch until they were out of the driveway. Carol came and stood next to me. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Then she said, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the paperwork from when we set up the trust. I told her. Every detail I could remember. And then I went back to my desk, and I spent that evening going through every piece of paper I could find, looking for anything else that didn't belong. I found 2 more things before midnight. A brochure from a memory care facility, folded in half and pushed to the back of a side drawer, the kind of thing you don't notice unless you're looking, and a sticky note with a name and number that I didn't recognize. When our attorney ran it the following week, it came back as a financial advisor who specialized in estate restructuring. My son-in-law had been in my office at some point during that weekend. I didn't know exactly when. I didn't know how long. But he had been there. Our attorney was thorough. I'll give her that. She told us to document everything and not to tip our hand. She reached out to a colleague who handled elder financial abuse cases, and that attorney made some quiet inquiries. What came back over the next 3 weeks was more organized than I had expected. My son-in-law had been talking to that law firm for 7 months. The preliminary review in that email was not the beginning, it was a follow-up. There had been 2 consultations before it. The strategy they were developing would have involved petitioning for a conservatorship based on documented evidence of cognitive decline. The documented evidence they were planning to use was a series of incidents: the forgotten dinner reservation, a time I'd mixed up 2 appointments in the fall, A time my daughter had mentioned, casually, that I'd called the dog by my old dog's name. Small things. Ordinary things that happen to people when they're tired or distracted. The kind of things you notice and forget in the same breath. But when they're written down in a legal document and presented in sequence, they start to look like something else entirely. He had been collecting them. Every small slip, every ordinary forgetful moment, written down somewhere and saved. Building a file, building a case. When my daughter found out, she called me from the road. She had been in her car, alone, and I could tell by her voice that she had been crying before she dialed. She said she'd confronted him. She said he'd denied everything for about 30 seconds, and then, when she put the documentation in front of him, he'd stopped denying and started explaining. He said it was for her benefit. He said he was protecting the family. He said he was worried about my health and hadn't wanted to upset anyone prematurely. She said, "He looked me in the eye and told me he was doing it for me, Dad." I didn't know what to say to that. I just stayed on the phone with her. She said she'd asked him, straight out, whether he had ever believed there was anything wrong with me, or whether he'd just seen an opportunity. She said he didn't answer. He looked at the floor and didn't answer, and that told her everything she needed to know. The legal process moved more quickly than I expected once it started. Our attorney filed a complaint. The law firm my son-in-law had been consulting dropped him immediately. They wanted no part of what was coming. There were enough communications, enough documented steps, to establish a clear pattern of intent. It never went to a full trial. He settled. He resigned from his job before anyone could ask him to leave. He moved out of my daughter's house in February. My daughter filed for divorce in March. She didn't ask for my opinion. She'd already made up her mind before she called me, and I think she just wanted to hear my voice when she said it out loud. I told her I was proud of her. She said she was so angry she could barely see straight, and that the anger was the only thing keeping her steady. I told her that was enough. That was more than enough. Here's what I want to say about the aftermath, because I think it's the part people don't talk about enough. Everyone wanted to know if I was devastated. My neighbors, my friends, the few relatives who heard pieces of the story secondhand. They asked if I felt betrayed, if I felt foolish, if I felt old. And I told them the truth, which is that I felt none of those things. Not exactly. What I felt was clear. For the first time in a long time, I could see every person in my life in sharp focus. I knew who had stood still and who had run. I knew who had asked questions and who had waited to see how it resolved before choosing a side. That kind of clarity is painful, but it is also, if I'm being honest, a gift. What I felt, most of all, was grateful. Not for what happened, I would undo it in a second if I could undo the hurt it caused my daughter, but grateful for Carol, for the woman who noticed when something was wrong in a room full of people who were missing it, for the woman who sat across from my son-in-law at Thanksgiving breakfast and passed him the syrup with a steady hand while her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, for the woman who said not yet when I wanted to explode, and was right. I've thought a lot since then about how I didn't see it. People ask me that too. How do you miss something like that for 6 years? And I've turned it over many times, and I think the answer is this. I saw what I wanted to see. He was polite. He was successful. He made my daughter happy, at least in the early years. And I wanted that for her more than almost anything. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because it was easier, and because I thought that's what a generous father-in-law does. What I know now is that trust is not the same as generosity. Trust has to be earned. And when someone is working to earn your trust, the right question to ask is, what are they working toward? I'm not angry at myself for missing it. I was doing what I thought love looked like, but I won't make that mistake again. And I hope you hear that, wherever you're listening from, because it matters. It matters to pay attention. It matters to listen when the person next to you lowers their voice and says something isn't right. Look at this. It matters to stop and look. Carol and I are still in this house. Same oak floors, same wraparound porch. The wallpaper she picked out is still in every room, and on a Sunday morning in November, when the light comes through the east windows at a certain angle, and the dog is asleep in the hallway, and the house is quiet, it still feels exactly like what we built it to be. Our daughter is doing better than I expected, honestly. She's strong, stronger than she sometimes gives herself credit for. My grandson asks about his dad sometimes, and she answers him with a patience and a steadiness that makes me proud in a way I don't quite have words for. He'll understand more when he's older. For now, he still chases the dog through the hallway and asks for pancakes on Saturday and doesn't know yet how complicated the world gets. I'm glad he doesn't know yet. There are things I wish I had done differently. I wish I'd trusted my instincts earlier, the moments when something felt slightly off and I talked myself out of it. I wish I'd had that conversation with my attorney sooner. Not because it would have prevented everything, but because there is a version of this story where my daughter spends 10 years of her life with someone before the whole thing unravels. And I don't want to think too long about that version, but I didn't put that email in my office. I didn't choose to be the target of it, and I refused to carry it like it was my failure, because it wasn't. Some people walk into your life already planning their next move, and there is no perfect way to see it coming. What you can do is act when you find out. What you can do is not wait too long, not talk yourself into believing the comfortable version, not protect someone's feelings at the cost of your own safety. That's what I know now that I didn't know then. I turned 64 this past April. Carol made a chocolate cake from scratch, and my daughter drove up with my grandson, and he wore a paper crown he'd made at school and sang happy birthday so loud the dog started barking. We ate cake at the kitchen table, and he fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock. Carol and I sat on the porch after, just the two of us, with the porch light on and the night quiet and the yard looking exactly like it always has. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Like someone who knows exactly who's on his side." She smiled at that. She took my hand. "The house is still ours. The property next door is still ours. Everything we spent 38 years building is still right where we put it. And the person sitting next to me on that porch, the one who saw it coming before I did, the one who said not yet when every instinct in me said now, she is still here, still paying attention, still the sharpest person in any room she walks into. I don't take that for granted anymore. This is my story, and I'm telling it because I know I'm not the only one. If you're sitting somewhere right now thinking something doesn't feel right but you can't name it yet, trust that feeling. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't give someone the benefit of the doubt when the doubt is already loud. Pay attention. The people who love you will tell you when something's wrong. Listen to them.